Science has not yet taught us if madness is or is not the sublimity of the intelligence. Greetings, Poe fans. The Poetastic 2, Carmen Bolden,
Jeanie Smith,
are back for our episode on
Sci-Fi
and science.
Okay.
So, Jeanie,
Yes.
what is science fiction?
I am so happy that you asked me that question because that is such an important question for this episode.
Yes, it is.
Based on the definition, the first known use of the meaning of science fiction started in 1898, and it is defined as a genre fiction in literature content as an imaginative but based in science, relying heavily on scientific fact, theory, and principles as a support for the settings, the characters, the themes, and the plot lines, which is what makes it different from fantasy. Because usually it has to be possible according to the science, or at least plausible. Thank you, literary-terms.net.
Yes, and that makes total sense. And so to really let's just define with an example.
Mm-hmm.
Star Trek is science fiction,
Yes.
but Star Wars is
fantasy
and science fiction.
Yes, it's a mixture of both, and most people forget about the both.
Yes, absolutely. And Star Wars has some, backgrounds in history, mythology with Perseus and
The Revolution, the American Revolution, and all that wonderful stuff that we love from history that most people don't, really care about, but we're just weird. But yes, fantasy isn't so much not a great part of the genre. It's just that people need to understand that there's a difference, because fantasy is just that.
Yes.
It's something we can imagine, but it can't be scientifically theorized.
Right. It doesn't have that evidence, that empirical evidence to back it up.
That hypothesis.
Yes. And it's good, though. All of it's good. We're not saying it's bad, but it's just, yes, you have to understand the definition.
Yeah. And vocabulary is a trip up for a lot of people.
Yes. And one of the books we've been reading is The Reason for the Darkness of the Night by John Tresch. It's an excellent, excellent book. Thoroughly enjoyed it. One of the things that, if you look at Poe's science fiction, kind of the definition, his is about mystification. So if you think of the poet Keats and think of the soul combined with Newton and the mind, there you have Poe.
And don't forget Da Vinci.
Yes.
Because Da Vinci was all about the body, the man, the anatomy.
Absolutely.
Because his was the first drawing that we got from scientific, well, I guess you could say theorized.
Yes.
For the anatomy was from Da Vinci's, and it's still being used, if I'm not mistaken, in today's medical books. So you have Keats with the mind, right? No, soul. Sorry. Keats is the soul.
Yes.
Poe is the mind.
Or no, Keats is the soul. Newton is the mind. And with those combined, like a math equation, you get Poe.
Yes, exactly. And Da Vinci is like an extra exponent.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. So going into thinking about Poe and his science fiction, we wanted to make sure that we defined it, but also talking about the history of sci-fi.
Yes, because science fiction is, it's fairly new. I mean, it's barely a little over 100, maybe 125 years as actually being defined as a meaningful genre.
Yes.
Before that, it was in a lot of literature. It was being used by a lot of authors, but did not have that definition of what exactly it was. And plus, you have to realize that in the early years, the only media that they had for posting science fiction literature was through magazines, newspapers, written word. And it wasn't until you had H.G. Wells and that one wonderful, wonderful story, War of the Worlds, that popped up and caused a major hysteria through the use of the radio.
Yes, and I think that was 18. I'm sorry, I'm getting my 18s and 19s mixed up. Jeannie was laughing at me earlier.
That's all right.
1938
yes.
when Orson Welles did that.
October 30th, pre-Halloween, October 30th, 1938. But that was not the first time actual written caused hysteria. Well, not to that extent, but caused a ruckus, so to say, in the world.
Yes, and that was April 13th, 1844, when Poe wrote an essay, or portrayed it as an essay. It was really a short story, in the broadside, the New York Sun, and later on it was called The Balloon Hoax. But people believed that someone made a transatlantic voyage in a balloon successfully, and everybody was going crazy over it.
Oh, yes. And I mean, because you have to think about it. If we think about it now, Edgar Allan Poe was using newspaper, magazines as his own social media platform.
Yes.
To influence the masses, to propagate his ideas. So if you would think about it in that time frame, a hot air balloon flying across the transatlantic would have been way, way out of the vision of anyone.
Absolutely.
Because, I mean, you have the thought of, wait a minute, it's a hot air balloon. That is not possible because, God created us to be on the ground. We just barely made it to the New World on a boat, much less flying anywhere.
Exactly. And this was not the first story that Poe used with balloon travel. He also did The Unparalleled Adventure of One Hans Pfaall, and that was in 1835. And then later on, long time after he did The Balloon Hoax, he also did the Mellonta Tauta, which is another balloon tale, in 1848. So he really wove in balloon travel, and a lot of the weather types of things were, weather as science was incorporated.
So he was bringing in the science that was going on at the time, because that was during another Enlightenment time period of history where a lot of people were crossing over religion with what was going on in the scientific world.
Exactly.
And wasn't it Emily Dickinson? Was it? No. Who was the friend that contacted Poe?
Oh, Elizabeth Barrett.
Elizabeth. I always get the E's
now
out.
That's for his second hoax.
The second hoax.
When he did his second hoax, that was in December of 1845, and that was in the Facts in the Case of Monsieur Valdemar. Oh. And this was a tale of mesmerism that he wrote, where the main character, Valdemar, was dying of consumption, and one of his doctors, in talking with him before his death, and then while he was dying basically for 7 months, the doctor put him in a mesmeric state, and he would talk to him periodically about he's not dying yet, he wants to sleep, and things like that of that nature. Then he finally dies and becomes this putrid state. Poe also put that in and portrayed it as a real medical story. And he never did refute and say, oh, sorry, that was just a hoax. But that's when Elizabeth Barrett from across the pond contacted Poe and said, what are you doing? This is...
Yeah, are you trying to cause mass hysteria and cause everyone to lose their minds, thinking that a person can be hypnotized to think they're not dying and then tell themselves, oh, I'm going to die, and then turn into a pile of goo?
Yes, exactly.
That's pretty much what the whole writing was about, was, mind over matter, basically.
Yes, absolutely. And mesmerism was one of the areas of science, even though it was considered quackery back then. And Poe was a debunker of quackery, puffery, all of those things, trying to find those scientific...
ne'er-do-wells.
Yes, thank you. And trying to debunk them. And he was kind of known for that, and because he was not afraid to speak up about it. But mesmerism and phrenology were two of the things that he wrote about. Mesmerism more so, and he just, he was fascinated by it.
Yeah, I mean, who wouldn't be, especially in those days where you had a lot of people who were in the religious of healing hands, the healing waters, the healing of the people. And then they started bringing the science into it, and basically they were bringing in their tonics. This is cure everything, and basically it was nothing but alcohol.
Yes.
It was just, hey, let's get everybody and make everybody happy by getting them hyped up on alcohol, and we can convince them of anything. So, and I hate to bring this in, but it was also a cult type mentality.
It was, definitely. And, one of Poe's quotes from that time frame, "The nose of a mob is its imagination. By this, at any time, it can be quietly led." Because people would believe, if some hack on the street said, "I've got this, snake oil," we'll just kind of say.
Yeah, that's what they usually called it when they were not believing of the person. It's like this all-in, be-all, immediate cure, the snake oil.
Yes.
And most of the time they would listen, because these were traveling salesmen all dressed up in nice little outfits, and they looked like they knew what they were talking about. They looked like they were intelligent.
Yes.
So
they looked like they were credible.
Exactly. But yeah, Poe was very much a proponent of saying you're an idiot. You're a quack. Stop trying to say something that's not. And one thing I do love, especially in his short stories or articles, I guess one of the two, we could call it with Dupin, was that he was using forensic science in his stories.
Yes, he was.
And most people don't realize that the forensic science that we pretty much see now on CSI or any of the Law and Orders, or if we just do the DNA testing that they have everywhere now, that's not the first forensic science that's come around.
Exactly. And I don't think people realize how far it has come. I mean, you were telling me some details that I was just like, wow.
Yeah, back in the Sumerian and the Babylonian times, some merchants would actually fingerprint people that bought their goods and fingerprint it on like little clay tablets, and then that would be their receipt. So if they bring it back and they need more, they would just show that. They would match their fingerprints, and they would know what they would need. And they would keep track of their billing that way. And it was just so phenomenal that this was like 600 BC.
Yeah, that's just that's hard to believe, really. It
is just so amazing to think about that. And then the whole idea of science started with Demetrius, back in 492 BC, when he coined the term for an atom, which means it was indivisible, and they saw the first smallest particle of matter. Not of life, but of everything.
That's wild. That is really wild.
And you're like, how can these people... Because if you think about it today, we still have scientists that are struggling with finding cures for cancer, finding potent drugs for all types of diseases to try to help slow it down or stop it. But you have to understand, we have developments of antibiotics that came around. We had penicillin that was discovered. The Black Plague, most people think that it's been eradicated, but it's not.
No, exactly.
It's still around, but because of the medication and the level of hygiene that we have in today's times, nobody thinks about it. I mean, there's maybe 7 cases a year in the United States of the Black Plague.
And that's wild to think about, too.
A cat got it. An actual cat in Colorado contracted the Black Plague like 10 years ago. I was reading the article from one of the science journals and everything, and I'm going, that poor cat.
Did he get it from fleas?
No, I don't think so. I think he got it from a human, because it was contracted that way because they had come back from another country and they had gotten it from the fleas.
That's interesting.
So, and I was like, this is
I just think
weird.
Of the fleas on rats. And,
fleas on rats. I hate that song.
I know.
I mean, I'm so happy as a school teacher that we've come up with something to help the kids learn it.
Yes.
But once you've heard that song with like 100 kids singing it down the hallway, it gets a little tiring.
It gets old, yes. One of the other things that Poe debunked was Maelstrom. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. In 1836, he introduced an automaton chess player. And when Poe saw this, he was using deduction. He was using his ratiocination, ideals and things, and basically debunked it because he was like, there's just no way. And so it's just very interesting how fascinated he was with science.
Yeah, and it is, and it's kind of amazing that even though he was so fascinated with science, that he never really took that path to go towards science.
Right. He did a little towards the end of his life. I just wonder if he had lived, if he would have taken it further. I kind of think he might
Could
have
been because of the Virginia and her health, and that might have pushed him towards a little bit more of the science area.
Absolutely.
But I was thinking, I had mentioned this to you earlier, that along the same time frame with Poe and the other scientifics that's going on, most people may not know Dmitri Mendeleev, but he is known as the father of the periodic table.
Right.
That he was the one that portrayed that, hey, I can tell you if an element is actually an element, and they don't even have to be found yet.
That's wild.
And it's all because they go in an order. And he found that order. And that was just so amazing to me that he was like 14.
Wow.
When he started this idea. And this was before they ever came up with electron clouds and all that wonderful stuff. But Charles Darwin, one of Poe's peoples.
Oh, and contemporaries, because they were born the same year, which is really kind of cool.
Yeah. And I just think it's so interesting that Darwin, he was supposed to be a doctor because his father was a doctor, but he went to Cambridge to become a doctor and study, and found out, hey, he can't stand the sight of blood. So that's why he went into the theoretical side.
That's a bad thing to happen.
Yeah, that was really bad. His father was rather disappointed.
Oh, I can imagine.
And so was Charles. He was rather disappointed, but he took it to another world, and he brought us into another world of the origins.
Exactly.
He went more on the theoretical, the research side of things, and evolution, which that's a bad word in school systems.
Yes, it is.
Or in some areas. But I'm like, they worked together. And in the early 1800s, they proved that you had the Enlightenment period, you had the Reformation, and you had the scientific revolutions. They all kind of go together. You can't really have one without the other.
Right. And, thinking about Poe connected with Darwin, you could kind of compare both of them together. Poe, in his look into science, he wasn't really questioning the divine, God.
No.
But he questioned how God could allow the perverse or just destruction, disease and things like that. How could that come down? How could God put that on someone that he created? And that was one of the things that he looked into. And that's kind of some of the science behind his work, Eureka, which is a 100-page, basically kind of textbook, if you will, on his science. It wasn't necessarily great in terms of, but one of his, basically a big principle out of that was, if you have gravitation versus attraction, in other words, material versus the body, then you kind of take it one step further with electricity is like the material and the gravitation, and the repulsion is like the body and attraction. Then you also have the spiritual, which is the electricity, and the soul is the repulsion. And that's kind of what he was looking at. And are we, in one of his kind of questions to himself, are we allowed to infer that there are other worlds out there? So if you think really deep down into that science fiction that's come out, was he thinking about aliens?
Yeah, the philosophy, because even today you can't turn on the television or History Network or anything and see the archaeological side of things where they're finding things that don't quite fit.
Yes.
And then you have to also think, okay, well, fiction, is one of those things where the imagination has to come into play. But also, I love, this goes back to a Spock quote.
Mm-hmm.
I can't, please forgive me for any Spock fans if I blow this one. Because it's been a long day already. And it's like, what is it he says that once, it was from the new one. Oh, the one that where is once you take out what's not possible, then the only thing left is what's probable.
Okay, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I think that's pretty close.
Yeah, it's like something about once you, whatever is not possible then becomes probable or something to that effect. But if you want to, and you have to think about it, because all scientific method starts with a question.
Yes.
So
and even
question.
Poe's science is he delved into the scientific method.
Yes, it is a hard one, and just like the name of that book, Eureka, goes back to Greek, the Greek scientists.
Exactly.
Oh, Trochilus, was it Trochilus? I can't remember right now. Do not quote me.
It's people. Okay. It's all right.
But the scientist who was sitting in the bathtub and noticed the floating of the water and density, and his response was Eureka.
Yes.
Poe, there you go. He titled one of his books because it is Eureka.
Exactly.
Science is all about questioning. That's what it truly is.
Exactly. And when you think about some of Poe's people that he influenced him science-wise, you've got Bach, Henry, Brewster with optical illusions. That's where Poe went to find all of his information from his book about optical illusions. Pierce, and that's Peirce. Kepler also.
Oh, yes, Kepler.
Newton, of course. Bacon, of course. And in Eureka, he really delved into Humboldt, Avec, Laplace, and another one that we've already talked about, Darwin.
Oh, yeah. And you got to think, the man was already on that precipice with his macabre.
Oh, and Mesmer, of course.
Yeah. And he was all about the questioning.
Yes.
And the questioning of life, the questioning of things, of the existence of everything. And I think that's what made him both on the side of the gloom, the doom.
Yes.
But also on who am I? He's very philosophical
and existential.
The man was a walking existential crisis.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the darkest periods in his life was around 1844-45 till he died, and especially when Virginia died, he was battling becoming successful. And then when he would get too successful, his work would be too intense because he was doing a lot of the editing and writing himself at the magazines he worked with, while Virginia was sick, and trying to make sure that he had money to feed her, him, and Muddy. And so then when he would get stressed, he would turn to alcohol, and it was just this vicious cycle of coming out of that, and
very much so
crept on and on throughout his life. And I think, yes, science definitely helped him look into those things.
Yeah, and philosophy. And a lot of people don't realize that most authors have some touch of philosophical ideals.
Absolutely.
That they bring into their writing.
Yes.
And Poe would definitely be one of those, with his own philosophy of life. If you look at his writing, everything he's actually written is all about why I am. Yes,
and one of the areas, I think this kind of ties in, he actually, some of the pieces that he wrote are the science of criticism. And it basically, like How to Write a Blackwood article, it's very much, this is the thought process of, there's a science behind writing poetry, writing criticism, writing anything. And so he kind of even turned his own writing into that. And some people criticized him back then, saying that his poetry was too much about the design, which goes into that scientific thinking. But there was a lot of feeling in that, and I think we see that today.
Yeah, very much so. And plus, even with Poe, he was always one of those authors that liked to push the boundaries.
Yes.
Because that one of the reasons he wasn't gravitated to as an author very much is because he didn't quite fit with what people wanted. And that was part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very cult type basis of who would enjoy his work. And it's as culture changed that when people started accepting more and more, because then after that you have Mary Shelley.
Mm-hmm.
Mary Shelley, who introduced Prometheus, or as we know him, Frankenstein.
Yes, or Frankenstein.
Yes. And she introduced him, but and
that was in 1818.
Yeah. And they very much wanted her not to publish under her own name because she was a female.
Exactly. And she wouldn't have been accepted, but she was.
And she said, no, I wrote this. And she wrote it on a dare, which I thought was great.
I know. It's great.
She wrote it on a dare from her husband and then his friends, all those wonderfuls. And she's like,
there's a drunk history episode about that, actually.
Exactly. Hey, drunk history is a great thing.
It's pretty accurate too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you have Prometheus, which is all about science fiction, but then if you think about it in today's times, rebuilding someone by putting in fake kneecaps, putting in titanium hip bones, kind of going right back around to where, wait a minute, it's no longer fiction.
Right.
And then you brought into H.G. Wells with War of the Worlds. You had Time Machine. Then that started growing, and it fit with that time period.
And before him, you had Jules Verne.
Oh, yes, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Yes.
Dude, you're talking about being able underwater, so in a boat. Oh, wait, we call that a submarine.
Yes.
And the very first submarine that we thought about was the Hughley that was in the Civil War. Mm-hmm. That didn't end well, by the way. We won't go there. So then H.G. Wells, but then the popularization of radio after the Great Depression.
Yes.
That's when Orson Welles, mass hysteria. Because it all had to do with people's beliefs and the way they think and what they liked and the culture. And it just started spiraling even more, and it started going up, and then I love the one quote from the Smithsonian Magazine. Orson Welles says, "If I wanted to ruin my career, boy, did I do it right." Yes. Because he had threats on his life and everything when they found out that all that was fake.
Exactly. And yet something that we were talking about before when we were planning this episode. Okay, Verne and H.G. Wells both said that Poe influenced their works, and you can see that in, very many stories that they wrote. But one thing that we never could find, and we may have to just do a little bit more digging, but with Orson Welles and the whole hoax thing, did he see that Poe did that and thought, hey, that's a great idea? Or was it just because during that time frame, there were a lot of people doing those hoax kind of things during Poe's time in the 1830s, 1840s. So was it just a general thing that Orson Welles kind of read about? You wonder, was it Poe? Was it somebody else, or just the general? I
think a lot of it had an influence both with Orson Welles in his current career, because Mercury Theater, he was big popular there. Then he started doing the radio, and I did read in the magazine article about how the producer approached him and wanted him to choose a story to do it on air, because Orson Welles has had that machismo, or
that voice
that
we can say what's kind of an animal magnetism, which is basically mesmerism.
Exactly.
So I just have to throw that in there.
Mesmerism. Yes. It's very true. That's how cult leaders do it.
Yes.
They mesmerize through their voice. And Orson Welles, I have to agree, if I'd heard that, because he designed it not only with his voice, but with the way he designed the radio broadcast that had people sucked in, that they thought it was true. Yes. And the bad thing is at that time frame, they had no other way of knowing it wasn't, because the radio was the only mass media at that moment.
Right. Right.
Because if it had been on the newspaper, that it had to wait the next day. And that's when they found out the next day it was all a hoax.
Yeah.
But they caused mass suicides and mass stampedes. And it's just the influence of grabbing people and convincing them that well with a fictional story.
I know. It would have been interesting to live during that time and experience that.
Yeah, because you have to think about it. I mean, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that's how he reached the masses after the Great Depression to get them back on track with his fireside chats.
Right.
So they relied upon that to help them persevere through one of the most devastating times of our history economically. You know, people losing their jobs, families going hungry. And then we were just coming out of World War II. I mean, World War One.
Yes,
my apologies.
yeah,
About
that's
to
okay.
go into World
Right.
War II. Got my twos and my ones backwards.
That's okay.
And then you led all that up, and then after World War II, we had something else that came into science. We had the computer. You know, we had this giant mass 30-ton processing system. The very first computer had to take up a whole room. Nobody could move it. It wasn't portable. Trust me, it wasn't going nowhere.
No.
Nowhere. And then all of a sudden, it's like technology started growing.
Yes.
And with technology, ideas started happening. And then innovations started coming into play. And so fiction wasn't so much becoming fiction anymore. And then you got in the 60s, my fave, Star Trek.
Yes.
Gene Roddenberry, he was very much a man of like, I know what I need to do.
Exactly. Yes. And we were talking about it earlier. You know, the quote, art imitates life. Sci-fi or science imitates sci-fi is what I said. And then Jeannie said sci-fi is an influence for innovation.
Yes.
And I think those are so true today.
Yes. I mean, without asking that question through science and without coming up with the imagination of fiction, you don't really have the innovation because you've already got something, but then you're like, the innovation is how can we make it better?
Yes.
You know, and that's just like most people in Star Trek. In the 60s episodes, they had the little communicators, their little flip things to talk back. I mean, hey, guess what? We don't have flip phones anymore, and if we do, people just look at them and go, what?
Yes.
Oh, I did find out Ed Sheeran does have a flip phone, by the way. And he says, why do I need a smartphone? This does what I need it to do.
That's interesting for the age that he is.
Yeah, I know. And that was one of the things that blew my mind. But they were kind of based off because at that point, that was fiction.
Yes.
Being able to communicate with a wireless piece of plastic.
Or video chats or things like that.
Or talk across a distance and all of a sudden, bam.
And you bring in the Jetsons, too, with that kind of thing.
Exactly. Meet the Jetsons. Okay.
Yes.
And then you got Star Wars coming around.
Yes.
That's adding in its own little mix of space travel, but adding in that fantasy along with historical fiction.
Exactly.
And you're just blowing it up.
Yeah, and some of the other categories that Poe wrote about with his science fiction, you know, he was a cryptologist. He would have cryptograms in the paper and magazines and things that people would solve, and sometimes people would even create their own and send to him to solve, and he solved all of them. And it's like we can't make something he can't solve, which is really kind of fun.
And what I think is very ironic with that, I would love if Edgar Allan Poe was around today so he could see the sequences for the DNA and the genome sequences, because it is literally like deciphering a cryptogram. You know, you have all the different AATs, you have the CGCs, you have to literally figure out what protein is used to create from that one little cryptogram, basically.
Yes.
And it is right up his alley.
I think the FBI probably could have used his prowess in solving cryptograms with letters from serial killers as well.
Oh, yes. I mean, he probably wouldn't have taken, 25, 30 years to solve the Zodiac
Exactly. Yeah.
cryptogram. He could have had it done quickly. He could have been, Spencer Reed from CSI.
I agree. I wonder if he's spaced a little.
I was
We'd have
wondering
to
about
look that
that
up.
too, because think about it. He was very, okay, sorry.
All right, no.
We're delving into that one.
Yeah, so cryptology, that was a big part of Poe. We also, to mention, like the dystopian kind of culture, Earth destruction, optics, cosmology, basically the general design of the universe and things like that. Let's see. Egyptology, galvanism, demonic possession, just math in general, alchemy, and the resurrection of the dead. And then one thing there was a little bit of is time travel. And you said, I wish Poe was here today. I found an article, and we'll link this and Poe's works that are based in science fiction in our references. But there was an article that, was Poe a time traveler, because some of his stories mention dates in the 2000s. You kind of wonder, why did he pick those dates? And so you really, I think one of them was like 2048 or 2049. I can't remember, but it's something crazy to think about.
Well, I mean, even crazier is think about Nostradamus.
True. Yes.
Can that man alone just be a time traveler himself? Because you cannot mark a lot of history. I mean, the Farmer's Almanac, that is definitely science.
Oh,
absolutely.
absolutely.
And that's one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that if you look at the science of the earth, you can do predictions based on that. That's like me trying to explain to the kids what a meteorologist is.
Oh, wow.
And they're like, what's that? That's the guy that tells you whether you get to go to school today or not because of snow.
Yeah, it's not predicting what meteors are coming to Earth.
Woman or, whatever.
Yes.
Your choice.
Yes.
But I'm just saying, it's just, a lot of it has to be predicting, and predictability goes along with just the basis of the Earth's rotation, the revolution, me explaining what gravity does to the tides and them giving me blank looks and me going, go back to 6th grade.
Yes.
This is science, people. Science.
Exactly. And one of the things that just, Poe trying to also have that influence in science, he used photography to craft his public identity with the daguerreotype, and he basically had his picture taken, if you will, around 6 times. And back then, we consider more photography as an art today, but it's really science too.
Oh yeah, because the development, excuse the pun, or cliche, whatever you want to call it. The development for the camera and the pictures and everything was very prominent during that time period, and a lot of people didn't realize how the science behind that was also killing them. Because they were developing it. I mean, Marie Curie and her husband, the big proponents, she won a Nobel Prize for finding radium.
Right.
And it was all great, and they did all these experiments, and it comes to find out, we died.
Yes.
Because of the radiation.
And in the daguerreotype, just looking into the science behind it, one of the chemicals that they used was arsenic.
And a lot of people don't understand there's arsenic being used today.
Yes.
In a lot of medications. And people don't understand that. And I'm like, it's okay, because it's not like in the good old days where they would take it and it was in raw form.
Right.
No.
And you have to have a lot of it to kill you.
Exactly. But there's a lot of stuff that we use in today's society that's very science-based that they used, and unfortunately they were our guinea pigs.
Yes, unfortunate is the key word there. Okay, so also we couldn't really find that these were authors and scientists that were influenced by Poe directly, but they definitely delved into similar topics, and that is Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov. Looked into similar categories. Also, for the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which is Poe's only novel, he used Reynolds' Potomac Voyage as, on the whaling track, which Herman Melville used also in Moby Dick. So, and there's a little tie-in there. And then also Pym, the character, was also compared to Crusoe, Gulliver, Sinbad, and also Baron Munchausen. When you think of, they weren't the same, but there were lots of characteristics that were very similar to all of those.
And I just think it's very ironic that the name Pym goes with Ant-Man, the scientist who created Ant-Man.
That's very interesting.
Was Pym.
There's another tie-in.
There you go. I mean, and that makes you wonder, wait a minute, is that a subtle implementation that they pulled?
I agree. That's
the illusion there.
There's a question there for digging later. And so, we're kind of wrapping up towards the end of our discussion. But one of the things we were talking about was, some of the research I did and Jeanie did was who is the real father of science fiction? And it's a great debate. I think everybody has a different opinion based on who they like the best or think about in historical terms. And I never could find a definitive answer, but the one thing that was definitive is that many people believe that Mary Shelley was the mother of science fiction with Frankenstein.
Yes, and it would make very much sense to say that, because if you look at the definition of science fiction, it very much fit with the Prometheus.
Yes.
However, I think the big debate is when it actually came into where someone defined it.
Yes.
The actual...
I think you were right. You had a very good point.
Yeah, the definition of what science fiction is did not actually get made until 1898. And that was almost, 80 years after Mary Shelley?
Yeah.
Yes. With Frankenstein. And so I think that a lot of definition doesn't really mark who does what. I think it's all about when you interpret it and when it starts to grow and when it becomes
the
part
popular
of the culture. Yeah, I think that's when the culture starts defining what makes the father of this or the mother of that.
Absolutely.
Because most people would debate that H.G. Wells be the father of science fiction, but then you can't forget about Jules Verne, you can't forget about Edgar Allan Poe.
Exactly.
And if you keep going back and back and back farther in history, you'll get even to more of the mythological.
Exactly.
Because if you look at the mythological, they used some science then, but it wasn't defined as science back then because they were just discovering it. Yeah,
I totally agree. And so, definitively, I don't think we can say Edgar Allan Poe is the father of science fiction, but he had a huge influence.
Yes, I think he was both influenced and was an influencer.
Yes.
Of the scientific
fake news
age.
too.
Yeah, fake news.
Who would have thought it would have started back then?
Yeah, hysteria and fake news.
Yes.
It seemed to be a trend way back in the day.
And has not stopped till today.
No, and I don't think it ever will, because with culture, there's always going to be two sides to every story.
Exactly.
And that's what some people need to remember, is those two sides to every story. And it all comes down to, what do you think?
Yes.
And what do you feel? And how do you want to define yourself based on what you know? And
when someone else has a different opinion than yourself, that's okay.
That is okay. And the problem that I have a big problem with, me personally, is the moment that you stop questioning.
Yes.
That to me means that you have a breakdown in the scientific method.
Yes, because to me that is the epitome of science.
Yes, you have to ask the simple question, why?
Yes, and keep asking why. And speaking of two sides and why and things like that, here's a question we're going to pose to you for next time with our next episode.
Yes.
And that is, who would have imagined that the Beatles have a connection to Edgar Allan Poe?
Dun, dun, dun.
So we are Carmen.
And Jeanie.
And we are
Poe out. It is by no means an irrational fancy that, in a future existence, we shall look upon what we think our present existence as a dream.